You should have seen my father's face when the news anchor said my name. 27 years of telling me I was wasting my life, throwing away my potential, embarrassing the family name. 27 years of him introducing me as his other daughter, while my sister got the spotlight. 27 years of rolled eyes when I talked about my dreams, of him changing the subject when relatives asked what I did for work. And there he was, frozen in his recliner, watching me announced as the youngest CEO in our industry's history on live television. His coffee mug suspended halfway to his lips, that smug expression finally wiped clean. This is the story of how the daughter he called a disappointment became everything he never thought possible, and why I made sure he found out this way. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Let me take you back to where this all started. I was 8 years old, sitting at our kitchen table with a pile of broken electronics I'd found in our neighbor's trash. While other kids were outside playing kickball, I was methodically taking apart old radios and game consoles, trying to understand how they worked. My fingers were small enough to reach the tiny components, and something about the logic of circuits just made sense to me. My father walked in from work, still in his pressed suit and tie. He was a regional bank manager then, climbing his way up what he called the right ladder. Success, to him, meant corner offices, business lunches, and a title that impressed people at cocktail parties. He took one look at my makeshift workshop, and his face darkened. "Sarah, what is this mess?" he demanded, his voice carrying that tone I'd come to know so well. Disappointment mixed with embarrassment, like I was personally failing him just by existing. "I'm learning how things work, Dad. Look, I figured out why this radio wasn't working. The capacitor was blown, but I found a replacement in this old—" "This is junk," he interrupted, sweeping my carefully organized components into a pile. "Little girls don't play with garbage. Where's your sister? At least Emma's practicing piano like she's supposed to." Even at 8, I knew something was wrong with that picture. Emma hated piano. She only played because Dad made her, because it looked good, because it was what successful families did. But I genuinely loved understanding how things worked, solving problems, creating something from nothing. That should have mattered, right? But Dad didn't see potential in my curiosity. He saw a tomboy making a mess, embarrassing him in front of the neighbors who might peek through our kitchen window. He saw everything he didn't want in a daughter. "Clean this up and go help your mother with dinner," he said, straightening his tie. "And Sarah? Next time, try acting like a young lady. Your future husband isn't going to want a wife who plays with trash." I was 8 years old, and he was already planning my failure. That night, I rebuilt the radio in my closet by flashlight. It worked perfectly, but I never told him. That was my first lesson in keeping my wins to myself. By high school, my little hobby had evolved into something much bigger, but Dad's attitude had only gotten worse. I'd started a small business, fixing phones and computers for classmates, charging $20 here, $50 there. I was making more money than most kids my age, but when Dad found out, he was mortified. "You're running some kind of repair shop out of our house," he yelled after Mrs. Henderson from down the street mentioned seeing kids coming and going with electronics. "What will people think? That we can't afford to buy our daughter proper things? That she has to scavenge like some kind of—" He never finished that sentence, but I knew what he meant. I tried explaining that I wasn't scavenging anymore. I was building something. I'd taught myself coding, started developing simple apps, even created a program that helped local businesses track inventory. But every time I brought up my projects, his eyes would glaze over, with that familiar mixture of boredom and disdain. "Sarah, you're 16. You should be thinking about college applications, not playing around with computers all day. Look at your sister, she's captain of the debate team, president of student council. Those are real accomplishments." The final blow came during my junior year, when I won a regional technology competition. $5,000 prize, scholarship opportunities, even a small write-up in the local paper. I was so excited to show him, thinking finally he'd see that what I was doing mattered. Instead, he barely glanced at the article before tossing it aside. "Cute," he said, not looking up from his own paper. "But Sarah, you need to focus on realistic goals. This computer stuff is a nice hobby, but it's not a career. You're wasting time that could be spent on real achievements." That word wasting, he used it like a weapon. Every project I completed, every problem I solved, every small victory I achieved was just me wasting time in his eyes. But here's what he didn't understand. While he saw worthless tinkering, I was building the foundation for everything that would come later. Every circuit I'd rewired, every line of code I'd written, every impossible problem I'd solved in my bedroom was preparing me for the moment when I'd prove him catastrophically wrong. I just didn't know it yet. College graduation should have been a celebration, but Dad turned it into another lecture about my poor life choices. While Emma was heading to law school following a respectable path, as he put it, I'd accepted a junior developer position at a small tech startup that most people had never heard of. The salary was decent, but that wasn't what mattered to Dad. What mattered was how it looked, how it sounded when he had to explain to his golf buddies what his daughter did for work. "She's in computers," became his embarrassed shorthand, delivered with the same tone people use to discuss unfortunate medical conditions. The comparisons started immediately and never stopped. At family dinners, Emma's law school achievements dominated every conversation while my work was dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Sarah's still playing with her computers," he'd tell relatives, but Emma just made law review. When our neighbor's son got promoted to marketing director at a Fortune 500 company, Dad spent 20 minutes explaining why traditional corporate hierarchies were the only real measure of success. When my college friend landed a job at Goldman Sachs, Dad brought it up for months, always with the same pointed look in my direction. "Now that's what I call a real career," he'd say. Not like this technology fad that'll be gone in a few years, but something was shifting inside me during those conversations. Each dismissive comment, each unfavorable comparison, each time he introduced me as his other daughter, was building something I didn't fully recognize yet, a quiet, steely determination. I stopped trying to explain what I was working on, stopped mentioning the projects I was leading or the problems I was solving. When he asked about work, I gave one-word answers. Fine. Good. Same as always. I started watching him more carefully during his lectures, studying the smugness in his expression, memorizing the certainty in his voice when he predicted my inevitable failure. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a plan was forming. Not consciously, not yet, but I was beginning to understand that proving him wrong would require more than just success. It would require the kind of undeniable, public vindication that would make his dismissive attitude impossible to maintain. I just needed to be patient, strategic, and absolutely, completely silent about what I was really building. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday night in March, 2 years into my first job. I'd been working late on a project that could potentially save the company millions, and I was excited, actually excited, to share something meaningful with my family for once. I walked into the living room where Dad was watching the news, and Emma was visiting from law school, fresh off some internship victory he'd been celebrating all evening. "Dad, I wanted to tell you about something I've been working on." I started, but he held up his hand without even looking at me. "Sarah, I need to talk to you," he said, finally turning toward me with that expression I'd learned to dread. Complete disappointment mixed with barely contained frustration. "I ran into Jim Morrison at the club today. You remember Jim, his daughter Patricia? She just made partner at her firm. 26 years old and already making 6 figures, driving a BMW, living in that new development downtown." He paused, letting that sink in. Then he asked about you, and you know what I had to tell him? That my 24-year-old daughter is still playing around with computers at some no-name company nobody's ever heard of. Emma shifted uncomfortably on the couch, but she didn't say anything. She never did. "I'm embarrassed, Sarah, genuinely embarrassed to call you my daughter sometimes. Here's Patricia, building a real career, contributing to society, making something of herself, and here's you, wasting your life on this technology nonsense that's going nowhere. You're smart enough to do better, but you're choosing to throw it all away on some childish fantasy." His voice rose with each word, years of frustration finally spilling over. "You're never going to amount to anything meaningful doing this computer garbage. Never. And I'm tired of pretending otherwise. I'm tired of making excuses for you to my friends. I'm tired of watching you waste every opportunity I've given you." The room went completely silent except for the television droning in the background. Emma stared at her hands. Mom was in the kitchen, pretending she couldn't hear, and I just stood there, feeling something crystallize inside my chest. Not anger, Something colder and more focused than that. Determination. Pure, strategic determination. "Okay, Dad," I said quietly. "I understand." And I did understand. I understood that he'd just handed me the exact motivation I needed to destroy every assumption he'd ever made about me. I just had to be patient enough to do it right. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom staring at the ceiling, I made a decision that would define the next 5 years of my life. I wasn't going to argue with Dad anymore, wasn't going to try convincing him or defending my choices, or desperately seeking his approval like some pathetic child begging for validation. Instead, I was going to disappear into my work and build something so undeniably successful that when the moment came and I would choose that moment, his shock would be absolute and public. The next morning, I started what I privately called the long game. At work, I began positioning myself differently, volunteering for the hardest projects, staying late not just to solve problems, but to understand every aspect of our business. My manager, David Chen, noticed immediately. "Sarah, you've been on fire lately," he said during a one-on-one meeting. "What's driving this?" I couldn't exactly tell him about my revenge plot against my father, so I just smiled and said I was ready for bigger challenges. David became my first real ally, someone who saw my potential and wasn't afraid to advocate for it. He started pulling me into strategic meetings, introducing me to senior leadership, giving me visibility I'd never had before. Then there was Rachel Martinez in our product development team, who became both mentor and friend. Unlike my family, Rachel actually listened when I talked about technology trends, asked thoughtful questions about my ideas, and treated my insights like they mattered. "You see patterns other people miss," she told me one day. "That's not common, don't waste it." But the most important relationship I built was with silence itself. At family dinners, I stopped mentioning promotions, stopped sharing project wins, stopped trying to translate my achievements into language Dad might respect. When he asked about work, I gave the same boring answers. Fine. Same as always. Nothing exciting. He seemed relieved that I'd finally accepted my place as the family disappointment. What he didn't know was that every dismissive comment, every eye roll, every time he changed the subject when I spoke, was feeding something powerful inside me. I was learning patience. Strategic, calculated patience. While he thought I was settling into mediocrity, I was quietly building the foundation for something that would shatter every assumption he'd ever made about his disappointing daughter. The best part? He was going to help me do it by staying completely oblivious until the very end. The next 2 years were a masterclass in enduring humiliation, while secretly building something extraordinary. Every family gathering became a performance where I played the role of the disappointing daughter, while Dad showcased Emma's latest achievements like trophies. Thanksgiving dinners were the worst extended family packed around our dining room table while Dad held court, regaling everyone with stories of Emma's cases, her salary increases, her partnership track at the firm. "And Sarah?" my aunt would ask politely, because someone always did. "Oh, Sarah's still doing her computer thing," Dad would say with that practiced dismissive wave, immediately pivoting back to Emma's accomplishments. Meanwhile, I was pulling 60-hour weeks trying to salvage a failing product launch, learning more about business strategy in 6 months than most people learn in years. My startup was hemorrhaging money, our lead investor had pulled out, and I was basically running on caffeine and pure spite. But here's what nobody understood about those struggles: they were teaching me everything I'd need later. Every crisis I solved, every disaster I prevented, every impossible deadline I somehow met, was building skills that would become invaluable. While Dad saw stagnation, I was becoming someone who could handle pressure that would break most people. The family Christmas party was particularly brutal that year. Dad spent 20 minutes explaining to our neighbors how Emma had been headhunted by 3 different firms, while I sat in the corner nursing a beer and listening to him describe my career as still figuring things out. My cousin Marcus, fresh out of business school, actually patted my shoulder and said, "Don't worry, Sarah. Not everyone can be high achievers like Emma. There's nothing wrong with being average." I smiled and nodded and thanked him for his understanding. What he didn't know was that 3 weeks earlier, I'd prevented our company from losing a $2 million contract by rebuilding our entire back-end system over a weekend. What none of them knew was that our CEO had started pulling me into board meetings, asking my opinion on strategic decisions, treating me like someone whose insights actually mattered. But I kept that information locked away, feeding my growing collection of secrets. Every dismissive comment, every pitying look, every time someone explained away my potential was fuel for what I was building. They thought they were watching me accept my limitations. They had no idea they were watching me gather ammunition. The first real breakthrough came 18 months later when I led the team that developed a security protocol that ended up saving our company from a massive data breach. While our competitors were making headlines for all the wrong reasons, we stayed bulletproof, and industry publications started calling our solution revolutionary. My photo was in TechCrunch, my name was mentioned in Forbes, and our CEO publicly credited me with preventing what could have been a company-ending disaster. The day the Forbes article came out, I left a copy on the kitchen counter where Dad always put his morning coffee. I didn't say anything, just waited to see if he'd notice. He walked right past it, picked up his mug, and started complaining about traffic without even glancing down. Later that evening, Mom mentioned she'd seen some computer article with my name in it, and Dad just grunted and asked if anyone had seen the remote. That was the moment I understood the game completely. It wasn't that he couldn't see my success, it was that he'd decided who I was so completely that contradictory evidence simply didn't register. When I got promoted to senior developer 6 months later, I mentioned it casually at dinner, sandwiched between asking for the salt and commenting on the weather. Dad nodded absently and immediately launched into a story about Emma's latest court victory. When I started getting invited to speak at industry conferences, I didn't mention it at all. When headhunters began calling with offers from major tech companies, I kept those conversations to myself. The pattern was becoming clear, and more importantly, it was becoming useful. Dad's blindness to my achievements wasn't a bug in our relationship, it was a feature I could exploit. Every success he dismissed, every milestone he ignored, every opportunity he failed to recognize was building towards something bigger. I started keeping a mental scorecard of moments when he could have acknowledged my growth but chose not to. Each incident was proof that when the final revelation came, his shock would be genuine and complete. He wasn't just underestimating me anymore, he was actively helping me stay invisible until the perfect moment to surface. The strategic silence that had started as self-protection was evolving into something more powerful, the ultimate weapon for someone planning the perfect vindication. Let him keep thinking I was going nowhere. It would make the destination so much sweeter. The breakthrough that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday in October when I got the call that would redefine my entire trajectory. Our startup had just been acquired by Technova Industries for $87 million, and I was being offered the position of Chief Technology Officer for their entire West Coast division. Not a junior role, not an assistant position, the actual CTO, overseeing a team of 200 engineers, with a salary that was more than Dad made in 3 years combined. I was 27 years old and suddenly responsible for technology decisions that affected millions of users worldwide. The signing bonus alone was enough to buy the house Dad had spent 15 years saving for. I said yes immediately, then spent the next hour sitting in my car in the parking lot, laughing at the beautiful irony of it all. That very evening, completely oblivious to what had just transpired, Dad launched into one of his classic lectures over dinner. Emma had mentioned some associate at her firm-making partner, which triggered his usual sermon about real career progression and meaningful achievement. "You see, Sarah," he said, pointing his fork at me with that condescending expression I knew so well, "this is what actual success looks like. Building something substantial, earning respect, making a name for yourself in a legitimate field, not this computer hobby that's going nowhere." I nodded thoughtfully, cutting my chicken while internally calculating that my new salary was roughly 4 times what his legitimate bank manager position paid. "Some people understand what it takes to build a real career," he continued, "and others just drift along playing with gadgets, never accomplishing anything that actually matters." The man who had spent decades climbing the corporate ladder to reach middle management was lecturing the woman who had just become the youngest CTO in her company's history. The satisfaction was intoxicating. "You're absolutely right, Dad," I said quietly. "Real success is definitely important." And it was important enough that I was going to let him keep believing I didn't have any, until the moment when his ignorance would be impossible to maintain. The best part wasn't just that I'd surpassed him, it was that his own arrogance was making him the perfect, unwitting accomplice in his own eventual humiliation. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Within 18 months of taking the CTO position, my career trajectory went from impressive to absolutely meteoric, and watching Dad remain completely clueless became my favorite form of entertainment. I was featured on the cover of MIT Technology Review, invited to keynote at major conferences, and offered board positions at 3 different companies. Tech Innovator magazine named me one of their 30 under 30 to watch, and my team's work on artificial intelligence applications was being discussed at government policy levels. Meanwhile, Dad was still introducing me at social gatherings as our Sarah, who works with computers somewhere. The cognitive dissonance was so extreme it was almost surreal. One particularly memorable evening, he spent 45 minutes at our neighbor's barbecue, explaining to anyone who would listen why these tech people would never understand real business, while I stood 3 feet away, quietly eating potato salad and thinking about the board meeting where I'd just convinced executives to invest $50 million in a new AI initiative. The problem with Sarah's generation, he announced to the assembled neighbors, is they think playing around with gadgets is the same as building something meaningful. Real business requires face-to-face relationships, understanding people, making decisions that matter. I smiled and nodded while mentally reviewing the email I'd received that morning from the CEO of one of our biggest competitors, trying to poach me with an offer that included equity worth more than Dad's entire retirement fund. The beautiful irony reached its peak when he started giving me career advice based on articles he'd read about the technology bubble. "Sarah, you really should think about transitioning into something more stable," he said one Sunday, completely serious. "This computer fad won't last forever. Maybe consider going back to school, getting an MBA, learning some real business skills." This was coming from a man whose biggest professional achievement was implementing a new customer service protocol at his regional bank branch, directed at a woman who was literally reshaping how entire industries approach digital transformation. I just smiled and thanked him for his concern, all while knowing that very soon his condescending advice would become the most expensive words he'd ever spoken. The contrast between his perception and my reality had become so absurd that revealing the truth was going to be absolutely devastating. There were so many perfect opportunities to shatter Dad's delusions, and choosing not to take them became an art form that required almost supernatural self-control. Like the time he was bragging to his golf buddies about some regional award his bank had won, while I stood behind him holding my phone with an email congratulating me on being named to Fortune's Most Powerful Women in Tech list. I could have simply turned the screen around and watched his expression crumble, but I slipped the phone back into my pocket and complimented his golf swing instead. Or the evening when our family friends started complaining about how impossible it was to find good technology leadership, while Dad nodded sagely and suggested they stay away from young people who think they know everything about computers. I was literally sitting at that same dinner table, having just turned down a CEO position at their company the week before because the offer wasn't interesting enough. The temptation to casually mention that fact was overwhelming, but I just smiled and asked for more wine. The most excruciating moment came when Dad ran into my college professor at the grocery store and spent 20 minutes apologizing for how I'd wasted my education on computer games instead of pursuing something serious. What he didn't know was that same professor had just written a letter recommending me for a position on the National Technology Advisory Council, calling me one of the most brilliant strategic minds he'd ever taught. I watched that entire humiliating conversation from the next aisle over, and instead of intervening, I took notes on every dismissive comment for my growing mental collection. Each moment I chose silence over vindication was building towards something bigger than personal satisfaction. It was creating the conditions for absolute shock, because here's what I understood that Dad didn't. The bigger the gap between his perception and reality, the more devastating the eventual revelation would be. Every opportunity I passed up to correct him was compound interest on his coming humiliation. I wasn't just planning to prove him wrong, I was engineering a moment so perfectly calibrated that his arrogance would become the very weapon that destroyed his credibility. The waiting was torture, but it was also strategic brilliance, and I was getting very close to cashing in. By my 30th birthday, I was operating at a level that would have been unimaginable to my 8-year-old self taking apart radios in the kitchen, but Dad's arrogance had reached absolutely stratospheric heights, creating the perfect setup for what was coming. I'd just closed a deal that brought in $200 million in new business, been offered equity positions in 4 different unicorn startups, and was secretly being courted for CEO positions at companies whose names Dad would definitely recognize. My personal net worth had quietly crossed into 8 figures. I owned property in 3 states, and my investment portfolio was managed by the same firm that handled Dad's retirement account, though they handled considerably more zeros for me. Yet somehow, his condescension had evolved into something almost artistic in its blindness. At family gatherings, he'd started using me as his go-to example of wasted potential, literally pointing at me while explaining to relatives why following your passion was terrible advice. "Look at Sarah," he'd say, gesturing in my direction like I was a cautionary tale come to life. "Smart girl, good grades, had every opportunity in the world, but she chose to play around with computers instead of building a real career. Now she's 30, and still working at some little tech company nobody's ever heard of." The little tech company, he was dismissing, had just been valued at $15 billion, and I was the executive leading their most profitable division. His lectures about my failures had become so elaborate and confident that extended family members started avoiding the topic of my career entirely, not wanting to trigger another 20-minute dissertation on my disappointing life choices. Last Christmas, he actually pulled my teenage cousin aside to warn him not to make Sarah's mistakes by getting too interested in technology. "It's a dead-end field," he said with complete authority. "Stick to traditional careers if you want to actually succeed." This was happening while my phone was buzzing with messages from 3 different executive recruiters trying to schedule meetings about CEO positions that would make international headlines. The gap between his perception and my reality had become so vast that closing it was going to require something truly spectacular. Fortunately, I knew exactly what that something was going to be. The call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 5 years after Dad's "wasting your life" speech, though I'm sure he'd forgotten the anniversary entirely. Marcus Webb, chairman of the board at Pinnacle Technologies, was on the line with an offer that made my heart race not because of the money or prestige, but because of the perfect, beautiful irony of what it represented. Pinnacle was one of the most recognizable names in technology, a company even Dad had heard of, with annual revenues exceeding $12 billion and operations in 37 countries. They wanted me as their chief executive officer. Not just any CEO position, but the leadership of a Fortune 100 company that regularly made headlines in every major business publication. The timing was cosmically perfect, because just 3 days earlier, Dad had cornered me at Emma's engagement party to deliver another lecture about realistic expectations and how I needed to stop chasing fantasies and focus on building something stable. He'd actually suggested I consider applying for entry-level positions at real companies where I could learn proper business fundamentals. What he didn't know was that every relationship I'd built, every conference I'd spoken at, every strategic decision I'd made over the past 5 years had been positioning me for exactly this moment. Marcus mentioned that my name had come up repeatedly in their search process, that board members from 3 different companies had recommended me, that my reputation in the industry was unparalleled for someone your age. The package they offered was staggering base salary, equity, performance bonuses that together would make me one of the highest compensated executives in the country. But the real treasure wasn't the money, it was the public nature of the announcement. CEO appointments at companies like Pinnacle didn't happen quietly. They were covered by every major business publication, broadcast on financial news networks, discussed in boardrooms across the country. There would be press conferences, interviews, photo shoots for magazine covers, and most importantly, there would be no possible way for Dad to ignore, dismiss, or explain away what I'd accomplished. I accepted the position that afternoon and immediately started planning the most satisfying phone call of my life. The next 3 weeks were a masterpiece of duplicity that I savored every single day. While Pinnacle's board was conducting final background checks, negotiating contract details, and preparing press materials for what they called one of the most significant leadership appointments in our industry this decade, I was sitting through family dinners listening to Dad explain why I'd never understand real responsibility. The legal team at Pinnacle had me sign 17 different confidentiality agreements, ensuring that news of my appointment wouldn't leak before their carefully orchestrated announcement. Meanwhile, Dad was telling anyone who would listen that I was finally settling into my limitations, because I'd stopped talking about work entirely. He actually complimented me for becoming more realistic about my prospects, The irony was so delicious I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud. During contract negotiations, I was literally designing the executive compensation package that would make me one of the youngest Fortune 100 CEOs in history, while Dad was in the next room telling Mom that maybe I was finally growing up and accepting that not everyone can be a high achiever like Emma. The beautiful thing about hiding something this enormous was that it required no effort at all. Dad's blindness was so complete that I could have been negotiating the deal right in front of him, and he wouldn't have noticed. I spent hours planning exactly how I wanted him to find out. I considered telling him directly, but that felt too private, too easy for him to minimize or rationalize away. I thought about having Emma break the news, but that would give him time to process and prepare some face-saving response. Then I realized the perfect solution. Let him discover it the same way the rest of the world would. Pinnacle had scheduled the announcement for a live television interview on Financial Network's morning show, followed by a press conference that would be broadcast across multiple channels. I was going to let my father learn that his disappointment daughter had just become one of the most powerful executives in America by watching it happen on live television, completely unprepared, with no time to hide his shock. It was going to be absolutely perfect. The decision to let Dad discover my new reality, through public humiliation rather than private conversation, was calculated revenge at its finest, and I spent weeks perfecting every detail to ensure maximum impact. A private revelation would have given him the chance to save face, to spin the story, to claim he always knew I had potential, or some other revisionist nonsense that would let him maintain his dignity. But a public announcement on live television, that would strip away every possible escape route and force him to confront the magnitude of his misjudgment in real time, with no opportunity to prepare his response or control the narrative. I knew his routine perfectly. Every morning at exactly 7:15, he'd settle into his recliner with coffee and toast to watch Financial Network before heading to work, the same habit he'd maintained for 15 years. Pinnacle had scheduled my announcement for 7:30 on a Thursday morning, which meant Dad would be watching when the anchor introduced the new CEO of Pinnacle Technologies, Sarah Thompson, whose innovative leadership and strategic vision have made her one of the youngest executives to lead a Fortune 100 company. The beauty of this timing was that he'd be completely unprepared, holding his morning coffee in his favorite mug, probably planning another lecture about my lack of ambition, when suddenly his disappointment daughter would be on national television discussing her plans to lead a $12 billion company. 5 years of strategic patience were about to pay off in the most spectacular way imaginable. Every dismissive comment, every eye roll, every time he'd used me as an example of wasted potential had been building toward this single moment when his arrogance would collide with undeniable reality on live television. I'd chosen the nuclear option for my vindication, and the fallout was going to be absolutely beautiful. All those years of keeping quiet, of letting him underestimate me, of watching him lecture me about success while I was quietly building an empire. He couldn't even imagine it was all leading to Thursday morning at 7:30, when his entire worldview would shatter in real time. I couldn't wait to see his face. The night before the announcement, Dad delivered what would become his final lecture about my failures, and the timing was so perfect, I almost wondered if the universe was conspiring to make this moment as devastating as possible. We were having dinner at Mom's favorite restaurant to celebrate Emma's partnership announcement, another family milestone where I played my familiar role as the disappointing backdrop to her success. "You know what I respect about Emma?" Dad said, cutting his steak with the precise movements of a man who loved making points. "She understood early that success requires sacrifice, discipline, commitment to excellence. She didn't get distracted by hobbies or waste time chasing fantasies." He looked directly at me with that expression I'd memorized over 3 decades, part pity, part frustration, complete condescension. "Sarah, you're 30 years old now. At some point you have to accept that playing around with computers isn't going to lead anywhere meaningful. Look at where Emma is. Look at where you are. The difference is choices." I nodded thoughtfully, checking my phone where 17 different news notifications were already queued up for tomorrow morning's announcement, including a Bloomberg exclusive titled, "Tech Visionary Takes the Helm, Sarah Thompson's Rise, to Pinnacle CEO. Maybe it's time to consider going back to school," he continued, warming to his theme. "Get an MBA, learn some real business skills, Start building something substantial before it's too late. This technology phase of yours has gone on long enough. The man who managed regional loan approvals was giving career advice to the woman who would wake up tomorrow as one of the most powerful executives in America. I finished my wine and smiled. You're absolutely right, Dad. Success definitely requires commitment to excellence. In 18 hours, he would be watching me discuss strategic vision and market leadership on national television while he got ready for another day of processing loan applications. The stage wasn't just set for maximum impact, it was set for complete annihilation of everything he thought he knew about success, failure, and his disappointing daughter. Thursday morning at 7:28, Dad was exactly where I knew he'd be settled in his recliner with his coffee and toast, half watching the morning financial news while scrolling through emails on his phone, completely unprepared for what was about to happen. I'd positioned myself in the kitchen, where I could see his profile through the doorway, pretending to make breakfast while actually witnessing the moment that would redefine our entire relationship. The anchor's voice filled the living room with familiar authority. This morning, we're joined by Sarah Thompson, who was just announced as the new Chief Executive Officer of Pinnacle Technologies, making her one of the youngest leaders to helm a Fortune 100 company. I watched Dad's head snap up from his phone, his expression shifting from mild interest to confusion as he processed the name. Then my face appeared on the screen, professional headshot, confident smile, with the chyron reading, Sarah Thompson, CEO, Pinnacle Technologies, across the bottom. The coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips and just hung there, suspended in space, as his brain tried to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he thought he knew about his disappointing daughter. Sarah, your rise through the technology sector has been remarkable, the anchor continued. Can you tell us about your vision for leading Pinnacle into the next phase of growth? And there I was, discussing market strategy, innovation pipelines, and global expansion plans with the kind of authority and expertise that Dad had spent years insisting I'd never possess. His mouth literally fell open. The coffee mug finally completed its journey to the side table with a sharp clink, but his eyes never left the screen. I watched 30 years of condescension and certainty drain from his face in real time, replaced by something I'd never seen before complete. Utter shock mixed with the dawning realization that he'd been catastrophically wrong about everything. When the anchor mentioned my $12 billion company and revolutionary leadership in artificial intelligence, Dad actually gripped the arms of his chair like he was trying to steady himself against an earthquake. The tables hadn't just turned, they'd been obliterated and rebuilt with me on top. The silence that followed the interview was broken by Dad's frantic scrambling for explanations, his voice cracking with the desperation of a man whose entire worldview had just been demolished on live television. I don't understand, he stammered, looking around the room like someone might provide an alternative reality. This has to be some kind of mistake. Sarah, what is this? When did... His phone started buzzing with calls from relatives and colleagues who'd seen the broadcast, and I watched him stare at the screen like it was displaying hieroglyphics he couldn't decode. Mom appeared in the doorway, having heard the commotion, and when she saw my face on the television screen with CEO beneath it, she just stared between the TV and me with the most beautifully confused expression. Emma called within 5 minutes, her voice shrill with disbelief. Sarah, is this real? Are you actually, how long have you been? But the most satisfying moment came when Dad tried to salvage some dignity by claiming he'd always known I had potential and had been waiting for me to apply myself properly. I just smiled, poured myself coffee, and said with perfect calm, Dad, you spent years telling me I was wasting my life and would never amount to anything meaningful. You used me as your go-to example of failure at every family gathering. Last night, you suggested I go back to school to learn real business skills. His face went pale as he realized that every dismissive comment, every lecture, every condescending moment had been witnessed by someone who was secretly building an empire while he mistook her for a failure. The beautiful thing about strategic patience, I continued, settling into the chair across from him, is that it gives you time to document everything. Every single thing. When his phone rang again, probably another colleague calling to congratulate him on his successful daughter, I watched him stare at it helplessly, finally understanding that he'd have to spend the rest of his life explaining why he'd been so spectacularly wrong about the person sitting 3 feet away from him. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been served ice cold with a 30-year build-up that made every bite absolutely perfect. Looking back on that moment 6 months later, I realized the journey changed both of us in ways I never anticipated when I first decided to play the long game. Dad went through what I can only describe as a complete ego collapse, not just the shock of being wrong, but the humbling realization that his own arrogance had blinded him to reality for years. The man who once lectured me about real success now asks genuine questions about my work, actually listens to my answers, and has stopped offering unsolicited career advice to anyone under 50. It's like watching someone rebuild their entire understanding of competence and achievement from the ground up. But the transformation wasn't just his spending 5 years, strategically hiding my success, taught me things about patience, resilience, and strategic thinking that no business school could have provided. Being systematically underestimated forced me to develop an unshakable confidence in my own abilities, because when no one else believes in you, you learn to trust yourself completely. The experience of being dismissed made me better at recognizing talent that others overlook, which has made me a more effective leader than I ever would have been without those years of invisibility. Our relationship now exists in this strange new space where he's simultaneously proud of what I've accomplished and deeply ashamed of how he treated me. While I'm learning to separate the satisfaction of vindication from the more complex work of actually rebuilding trust. He started telling people about my achievements with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost time, but I can see in his eyes that he knows those years of dismissal can't be undone with retroactive pride. The most unexpected part is that I've started to feel something like pity for him, not because he was wrong about me, but because his need to categorize and dismiss people robbed him of years of genuine connection with his own daughter. The revenge was perfect, the vindication complete, but what surprised me most was realizing that the real victory wasn't proving him wrong, it was becoming someone strong enough to succeed despite him, and eventually, compassionate enough to help him understand why that mattered. 6 months into leading Pinnacle Technologies, I've had time to reflect on what this whole journey was really about, and I want to share something important with anyone who's ever been dismissed, underestimated, or told they're wasting their life pursuing something unconventional. What I thought was revenge turned out to be something much more powerful. It was justice, not just for me, but for every person who's ever been written off by someone who couldn't see past their own narrow definitions of success. The difference between revenge and justice is that revenge is about making someone pay for hurting you, while justice is about proving that their judgment was fundamentally flawed. Revenge feels good for a moment, but justice changes how the world sees both you and them forever. When I watched Dad's face during that television announcement, I wasn't just getting back at him for years of dismissal, I was demonstrating that his entire framework for measuring worth was broken. Here's what I learned about proving doubters wrong. It's not enough to just succeed, because people can always find ways to minimize your achievements if they want to protect their egos. You have to succeed so undeniably, so publicly, so completely that denial becomes impossible. But more importantly, you have to succeed for yourself first, not for them. The moment your motivation shifts from proving them wrong to building something meaningful, that's when you become truly unstoppable. To everyone who's sitting at a family dinner right now, listening to someone explain why your dreams are unrealistic or your passions are worthless, document this moment. Remember exactly how it feels to be dismissed by someone who should believe in you. Then use that feeling as fuel, not for bitterness, but for building something so extraordinary that one day they'll have to confront the magnitude of their own blindness. The sweetest vindication isn't making them apologize, it's making them realize they never really knew who you were at all. And when that moment comes, when you're standing where I stood, watching someone who wrote you off struggle to understand what they missed, you'll discover that the real victory was never about them. It was about becoming someone who couldn't be diminished by anyone's opinion, including theirs.